Good morning. It's good to have the visitors that we have with us. Appreciate your coming and being with us. Have some in the community in St. Paul's area. So it's good to have you with us. I hope that as we go through the scriptures together, we'll have nothing but a common understanding of what God has for us to do and what God's will is. A couple of weeks ago, we looked at Romans 13 and passing on a lesson that I gave on capital punishment. We dealt mostly with the Old Testament on capital punishment. And we did touch on Romans 13, but I want to camp out now in Romans 13, the first 7 verses. And this is Daniel had asked a question based on the lesson about capital punishment. And seemed to focus on the colonies and how the colonials would have looked at this. And so I want to kind of challenge your thinking about this particular passage and what is the Christian's responsibility to government. And some have the idea that no matter what the government determines, no matter whatever laws the government passes, that man is obliged to obey whatever the government says. And that we should not question the laws of the government. And so I asked a couple of questions. Does the citizenry, especially made up of Christians, have any responsibility to hold government accountable to God's original design of government? And we find God's original design of government here in the first 7 verses of chapter 13. And if you lived in colonial America in the 1700s, would you have supported British rule or would you have been in favor of American self-rule, self-governance? That was the question that preoccupied the minds of those in the first few years of the founding of our nation, and even a little bit before that. And did they believe that they were fighting for a righteous cause? That's a question, and I think they did. Did they believe they were rebellious to a legitimate English government? I think the answer to that is no. They did not see themselves as against legal authority, but they viewed the English government as an illicit authority. And they used the word tyrannical authority. And did they believe that they were rebellious to a legitimate government? No. Did they believe that England was denying their God-given right of self-governance? And those were all questions that were in the minds of the colonials in this period of time. And what would your thinking have been in this time? And did they understand Romans 13? And that was a pivotal passage that, as I studied some of the documents of the Founding Fathers and their beliefs at that time, that this was a pivotal passage that was used to determine whether or not they should rebel against what they considered the tyrannical rule of England and set up their own government. And so did they believe they were obeying God's law as they rebelled against England and formed a completely different form of government? As a matter of fact, what I read, and I think that what I read is colored with some bias, because what I read seemed to indicate that they believed the government was God. I don't believe that's true. But I certainly believe that they understood that government came from God and that man was responsible to government. And did they believe that the English governance of America was immoral and tyrannical and illegal? Yeah, that was the basis upon which they set out to form another form of government. And you remember from your school school book days that taxation without representation, that was the cry that went out. That they wanted representation in their government and that they didn't mind paying the taxes. But the taxes need to be accompanied with a representative type of government. And so that was the main problem that they had, or one of the main problems that they had with the tyranny that they saw in the English government. And so Romans 13, as we look at this passage, was pivotal, led them to establish a new government and not be under the bondage of a tyrannical one. And they believed that England was denying the colonies their God-given right of freedom and self-governance. And they believed that was the rule of government, that was the purpose of government, to provide or to ensure that the freedoms that God had given to man were protected. And one can read the Founding Fathers' documents and see God's name everywhere. And in fact, it's hard to read some of the Founding Fathers' documents without seeing the name of God and references to the Bible in it. And so as they were expressing their views, they came to the conclusion that God's will is for their nation or for their people to create a government based on man's inherent rights. That these rights that are not derived from government, but they are derived from God Almighty. And they use this passage to foster that belief or to advance that belief. These passages that we're reading this morning. And so as we look, we can see, we understand that God created government. He very much says that in the first 7 verses of this reading. And as we look at a unique style of government that was designed by God, and when I say God created government, He did not create any specific type of government, except we might say for His people. There was a specific government, a specific law that God gave to Moses, as we studied this morning. That was God's law for His people. And every aspect of the Jewish society, every aspect of their lives, were regulated by this law. Whether you're talking about man's relationship to man or man's relationship to God, how one lived in society, what one did as a result of crimes that were against the laws of God, how fines were given, penalties were given, even the death penalty was to be enforced. And we focused on that when we gave our lesson on the death penalty. And so as we look at the type of government that God created, He created a theocracy. And it is a theocratic government where God is the supreme ruler, where God is king over both civil life and religious life. And the Ten Commandment law was representative of that law. And it was really the focal point of that law, where it regulated man's relationship to God, as well as it regulated man's relationship to his fellow man. And as you look at the first several commandments of that, you'll see the delineation between what God expects of man and how man is to relate to God, and then how man is to treat his fellow man within those commandments. And you can see the dual nature of this law as it's given to us, regulating man's relationship to God. And this was from the beginning of the law in Exodus chapter 20, where God gave that law to Moses and to the children of Israel. That they were to have no other gods before me, that they were to worship no graven images, nor take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, and to remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And we see in this the relationship of how God regulated man's relationship to God. And then we see God regulating man's relationship to man in the other commandments. Honor thy father and mother. Thou shalt not kill, or as other translators, as actually it's rendered, thou shalt do no murder in the original. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Thou shalt not covet. Deals with man's relationship and responsibility to his fellow man. And so legal punishments were given, as we see fines being levied and being given. And I gave passages that deal with those fines. There's no need for us to go over that. You can jot these down and look at them at your leisure. But it simply is to make the point that the law of Moses was both a civil law as well as a religious law. It was a law that controlled or directed man in his relationship to his fellow man, in his relationship to his nation, as well as in his relationship to God. There were fines that were given as two men strove together. Exodus 21, as two men strove together and hurt someone who is pregnant and caused her premature birth. And if no death or injury followed, then that husband could extract a fine, whatever he wanted, whatever he could get away with the judge. He would have to bring it before the judge, similar to our cases in our court, where you bring, we need to be compensated so much because these guys were fighting and caused my wife to give birth prematurely, and it caused us all these expenses, and we want that recouped. And so that's what they would do. However, if any harm followed, if there was a death that took place in either the mother or the infant, then life for life. And the death penalty was included in that law, how God would regulate man's relationship to his fellow man. Civil punishments accentuates the civic aspect of this law. The Old Testament law was nailed to the cross, Colossians 2:14, I recognize that, yet the Old Testament law, by Hebrews chapter 8, and unless you have this understanding of the law of Moses being a dual law, both civil as well as religious, you'll have an impossible task before you in trying to figure out what Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 13 means. So turn with me to Hebrews chapter 8. And he talks about, from verse 7 down, a new covenant. And he talks about there being, when he says a new covenant, made the first covenant old and obsolete. And now he comes to verse 13 and says, when he said a new covenant, he has made the first obsolete. But whatever is becoming obsolete. Now, remember when the Hebrew epistle was written. The Hebrew epistle was written shortly before Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, somewhere around 68, 69 AD, about 30 years or 35 years after the death of Christ. After Jesus nailed to the cross the old covenant. Whatever is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to disappear. He's talking about the old law. He's talking about the old covenant. What aspect of the old covenant had not yet disappeared? You remember as Paul came from his third preaching trip, and he came to the temple to give alms to his nation. And you remember James, as he came in, said, well, what you ought to do is, because the children of Israel have said that you have just forsaken the law of Moses. And you're teaching us everywhere. And what I want you to do is, you go and take these men and you pay their vow as they go into the temple and make this vow. And you pay their vow with them. You take that vow with them so all the people will know that you're not repudiating the old covenant. Well, the religious aspects of that law had been done away with. But there were still civil aspects of that law that still were in effect until shortly after this was penned in 70 AD, when Titus, the Roman general, came and utterly destroyed the Jewish nation. burned their records, destroyed the temple. And so the law of Moses still regulated civil life in Jerusalem. And so Paul could go into the temple and be regulated by that civil aspect of the law and have no problem taking a vow in the temple and having others take a vow, which did not impinge upon the law of Christ in any respect. And so we see the dual nature of this law being not only a civil law, but a religious law. And the religious aspect of that law were nailed to the cross, but there were still civil aspects of that law that were taking place all through Jerusalem. And the civil aspect remained until the Jews were completely destroyed, until Jerusalem was an ash heap. And in 68 or 69 AD, he can write, what is waxing old and is ready to disappear. Every aspect of Jewish society was ready to disappear. Every aspect of the law was ready to disappear. Jesus nailed to the cross the religious aspects of that law. But being a dual-natured law, the civil part of the law still was enforced in Jerusalem. How about our civil government in our day and time? Well, the New Testament law is entirely different from the Old Covenant. It is not a civil law. It is not a law designed to impose fines upon people when they do things to other people. But it, in a certain respect, does help us to understand how we ought to treat our fellow man. But it's not designed as a theocracy. It is not designed where God is the supreme leader and His law is given to man, and it regulates every aspect of their life from a civil perspective. Jesus' law, the law of the New Covenant, is purely a religious law. It does not have that dual nature that the Old Covenant had. The citizenship of this kingdom is not anywhere on the earth, but it's in heaven. Philippians chapter 2 and verse 20. We are citizens of that kingdom. It is a kingdom that Jesus said to Pilate is not of this world in John chapter 18. And he can say in the Sermon on the Mount, as well as other places, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And we see from Ephesians chapter 1 and verse 3 that we have all spiritual blessings in heavenly places in Christ Jesus. And we wrestle not against principalities and against powers, but not against the physical principalities and powers, but we wrestle against principalities and powers in heavenly places in Ephesians chapter 6. And Hebrews 12, our city is not an earthly one or an earthly government or an earthly society, but our city is a heavenly one. And that is the city in Hebrews chapter 11 that Abraham searched for, whose builder and maker was God. And we preach not man's wisdom, but what the Holy Spirit teaches. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, Paul says. And we are built up into a spiritual house. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 5. We are not a civil society. God's law, the New Covenant, is not a theocracy. It is not a law where God designed us to regulate every aspect of our civil society. And so, as we look at our system of government, our laws, there is something that's called separation of church and state. And usually stated to remove all religious expressions from government whatsoever. That's usually how it's stated. To remove any reference to God or anyone in government giving allegiance to God. Anyone offering any kind of prayers to God. To remove any references to God on all of our federal buildings. You remember the Ten Commandment law statue that was in the courthouse in Alabama was, our Alabamians are not here, but That was removed because of this argument of separation of church and state. But we believe in the concept as the first century, or as the first generation Americans did. We believe in this concept of separation of church and state. The church has no business in politics or in government. And the government has no business telling the church what it should do and what it should believe. Yet the government has no authority to remove any individual's desire to worship God the way he sees fit. And God gave the church to regulate us in our religious life, and he gave the state to regulate us in our social life, in our civil society, civil life. And so we have Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 3, that gives us God's design for government. And he says, let every soul be in subjection to the higher powers. And this is how the founding fathers referenced the government as the governing or the higher powers. For there is no power but of God, and the powers that be are ordained of God. Therefore, he that resists the power withstands the ordinances of God, and that they that withstand shall receive to themselves judgment. For rulers are not a terror of good works, but to the evil. And that was a pivotal passage that formed the concept in the minds of the colonials that this government in England was not was a tyrannical government, was not a government designed as God designs government. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. And wouldst thou have no fear of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise from the same. So government is designed to thwart evil behavior and to promote good behavior. That's what God designed government for. Any government, in the way that the colonials understood this, is any government that does not fit that purpose is not a legitimate government. And so we have man's responsibility to government. And it is very clearly and succinctly stated by Ronald Reagan, either you will control your government or your government will control you. Very somber warning. But that's absolutely true. Either you will control your government, you will keep your government in the guidelines that God has established government to be in and under, or your government will control you. And in our political age, in our day and time, we have people talking about how the government is going to control every aspect of our society. The government is going to give us free health care. The government is going to give us free education. The government is going to give us all of these free things. Well, the government doesn't give anything away. The government doesn't provide anything free. Everyone is going to pay for those free things that the government is giving. But the government is the one, when it provides all of those things, that is going to control our life in those things. And so what is man's responsibility to government? In view of the things that we're talking about here. And it is, let every soul be subject to the higher powers, for there is no power but of God, and the powers that are ordained are of God. Government is designed by God to regulate man's civil life. And we need to be in subjection to that government. Hypostasis. And it means to place under. It's a military term, to arrange in rank or in order. To be under another, to arrange under, to subordinate, to submit to one's command, to obey. That's our responsibility. But what is government's responsibility? How did God design government? They are the powers that be. The government is, in the abstract sense, no specific government is mentioned here, as we already said, without a regard to the type that it takes. So we must be in submission to the governing authority. And the ordinances of God, they are God's minister. Again, ordinances of God. I'm in Hebrews. I need to go back to Romans chapter 13. Whoever resists, verse 2, resists the ordinances of God. The ordinances of God is for us to be under the governing authorities, to submit to the governing authorities. And as we look at the book of Romans, it was written about 57, 58 AD. Nero was in power, and he reigned from about 54 to 68 AD. And Rome was the imperial capital of the empire. And we can see that Rome governed everything. They knew both its glory and its shame as they lived under the tyrannical rule of Nero. A fire consumed about 75% of the city. It burned for 7 days in 64 AD. Rumors persisted that Nero started the fires. And as a scapegoat to get away from the shame of having done that, he blamed the fires on Christians. And so he began a campaign of persecution against them. And Christians' animosity against Roman government would have been at an all-time high. I mean, you could understand how they would have a real problem with the government in the first century. Added to that, they served Christ, another king. Easily, they could have rejected Roman governing authority and abdicated or advocate a antinomian society, a society without law. They didn't do that. They lived under that tyrannical rule and reign. They were pretty much powerless to do anything about it since Rome was the ruler of the world. So God's original design in government became in sharp focus as the founding fathers decided what they were going to do, how they were going to create another government. And Thomas Jefferson said, "I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the minds of men." And the translation, in short, is all tyrannical governments must fall. All those governments that do not measure up to what God designed in Romans chapter 13 is not a legitimate form of government, he theorized. For the government is a minister of God to thee for good. That's God's design for government. A minister to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid. For he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is a minister of God, an avenger for wrath to him who doeth evil. Wherefore you must needs be in subjection. Because God designed government this way, and since God designed government this way, then you need to be in subjection to what God designed. But what if government no longer functions as God designed it? What if homosexuality is touted by a government as being an alternate lifestyle, and that which is good, and you can't say anything against it? What if evil prevails, and evil is touted by the government as being that which everyone should support. How did first century Christians handle governments like that? How would the founding fathers handle governments like that? How do we handle governments like that? What governments can and cannot do by God. They cannot convey rights to men. It is not the role of government to provide the rights that man has. That is what God does. God determines the rights of men. And freedom is given to every man by God. Freedom is not, and the rights that we have are not a product of our government or any other government upon the face of the earth. Our rights and our freedoms are based upon what God has given us. Governments are designed and can only restrict liberty. And the liberty God wanted restricted is the liberty to do evil. That's what God wanted restricted. Government regulates our physical lives as we live together. God did not design government to convey or restrict freedom. Although that's the natural design of government, is it restricts. Government is designed to restrict evil behavior and promote good behavior. That's the God-given design of government. Capital punishment, as we looked at in detail a couple weeks ago, is God's ultimate punishment of evil. It is instituted by God in Genesis chapter 9, as Noah came off the ark. One of the first things that God commanded to him was, whosoever shall shed man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. God regulated under the old law capital punishment and approved of its existence. And it's regulated from the New Testament only by God's minister, Romans chapter 13, verses 4 through 7. Not only is it to restrict evil behavior, design of government, but government is designed to reward good behavior, to praise and reward good behavior, verse 3. When good is punished, the government cannot be said to be what God designed, and it can be altered. It can be changed. To force government to conform to God's original design for it.